Every single day, nearly 200 people in the US are diagnosed with a cancer growing silently inside their neck, and many won't know it until it's too late. Here's a shocking truth. A fast-growing lump in your neck might not just be a swollen gland. It could be thyroid cancer, lymphoma, or even a deadly sarcoma. The worst part? Most people ignore it until they lose their voice or their breath. Your neck isn't just skin and bone. It's home to your voice box, lymph nodes, your thyroid. When a tumor develops there, especially one that's hard, fast-growing, or painful, it can press on vital structures like your airway or nerves. That's why any persistent swelling in the neck lasting more than 2 weeks should never be ignored. If you or someone you love notices a lump that's growing, changing, or making it hard to breathe or swallow, don't wait. Ask for an ultrasound. Ask for a biopsy. Early detection saves. This is just the beginning of Walter's story. A journey through fear, silence, and a powerful comeback you won't forget. If you care about real stories, real health, and real hope, hit subscribe and follow us, because one story might save a life. There was nothing remarkable about the morning Walter found the lump. No dramatic pain, no sudden dizziness, no flash of intuition. Just a simple shave. The steam curled around the mirror in his modest Newburyport bathroom, softening his aging reflection. The hum of the electric razor buzzed steadily, soothing in its repetition. Walter had done this every morning for decades. Same angle, same order, same final swipe under the jawline. That's when he felt it. A small, hard bump, right below the curve of his right jaw. Barely the size of a marble, firm, unmoving, painless. His thumb paused over it, pressed again. Still there, not squishy like a swollen gland. Not tender, just there. Walter blinked and leaned in toward the mirror, wiping away the condensation to study the area. But the skin looked normal. No redness, no swelling. Just his usual stubble, patches of gray around the chin. He muttered under his breath, a soft grunt that only the walls heard, and continued shaving. Routine resumed. Walter lived alone. That morning was like most others, quiet, predictable, defined by the small rituals that helped him forget time was passing. Breakfast was a single slice of toast, buttered without thought, and a lukewarm mug of black coffee. The same ceramic mug he'd used since 1997, now slightly chipped near the rim. He sat at the kitchen table, staring out the window as golden October leaves drifted down from the trees. The wind moved them in lazy spirals. Across the street, no cars passed, no dogs barked. Newburyport was like that, peaceful to some, painfully still to others. For Walter, silence had long since stopped being comforting. It was just there. Like the lump, and he tried to ignore it for most of the morning. He cleaned the dishes, folded yesterday's laundry, checked the weather 3 times, read the obituaries in the local paper without really knowing why. A part of him always did. He told himself it was to keep track of the town, but maybe it was more than that. Maybe it was a quiet acknowledgement that his name might someday be there too. Around noon, standing by the window with the sun hitting his shoulder, his fingers found the lump again. Still there, still hard, still silent. He stood still for a long time, the warmth of the sunlight doing little to calm the chill in his chest. What was it? Cancer, an infection, a cyst, or maybe just a side effect of age? Bodies change after all. They wear down. They sag, they shift, they create new quirks and creaks, and reminders that time is not gentle. Walter told himself exactly that. It's probably just a swollen gland. Give it a few days, no need to overreact. And with that, he filed the worry away, deep in the back of his mind, like an unopened letter he didn't want to read. But the truth was this: Walter had always been good at ignoring small problems. A squeaky pipe? Wait until it bursts. A rattle in the car engine? Turn the radio up. A pain in the shoulder? Sleep on the other side. That's how men like Walter survived. Raised in the age of stoicism, trained to endure, conditioned to believe that pain was weakness. You don't see a doctor unless something is broken or bleeding. And even then, maybe wait until Monday. So no, Walter didn't panic. He didn't call anyone. He didn't tell his son. He didn't write it in his journal. He didn't even whisper it aloud. He simply sat back down, folded his hands, and watched the wind scatter the last of the yellow leaves across the empty street. The lump was quiet. So he would be too. Walter's house creaked with age, just like him. Every night, the baseboard heaters let out tired groans, and the wooden floors echoed with memories that no longer walked them. He hadn't redecorated since his wife passed. 6 years ago that October, her coat still hung by the front door, untouched. Not because he couldn't bear to move it, but because he no longer noticed it at all. Life had dulled at the edges. Colors muted, scents faded, sounds softened by routine. That night, brushing his teeth, he avoided the mirror. Not because of vanity, he had long made peace with the wrinkles, the thinning hair, but because of the small shadow under his jawline. The place where his skin no longer looked symmetrical, the place where something now lived. He touched it once more in the dim light. Still there, still silent, still uninvited. He stared at the toothbrush in his hand, foam collecting in the corners of his mouth, and sighed. It was probably nothing, just like everything else. Walter had always trusted the passing of time to resolve things. Loose screws, strained friendships, persistent coughs. They either fixed themselves or faded into the background. Time had a way of making everything seem smaller, more manageable, less urgent. So when 3 days passed and the lump in his neck hadn't gone away, he didn't panic. Not outwardly. Instead, he opened a drawer in the hallway and pulled out a yellowed folder labeled Medical. Inside were decades of paperwork, blood tests, flu shots, old insurance summaries. He flipped through the stacks slowly, searching for a number. A doctor's office he hadn't visited in over a year. Dr. Fisk had retired, he remembered. The new physician's name escaped him. He dialed anyway. The receptionist's voice was young, clipped, cheerful in a rehearsed sort of way. They could see him in 6 weeks. Walter thanked her and hung up. 6 weeks. 42 days. He did the math twice, as if numbers might lie. It wasn't that he couldn't find another doctor. There were clinics, urgent care centers, but there was something paralyzing about reaching out. Something about naming a worry out loud that made it real. He wasn't ready for that. He Googled his symptoms that afternoon. Hard lump, painless, under jaw. The results were predictably vague. Could be a cyst, could be lymphoma, could be a salivary gland stone, could be nothing, could be everything. He clicked through 3 pages before shutting the laptop, unsettled not by what he read, but by how easily he could rationalize each result. For every possibility that scared him, he found another that didn't. It was a balancing act of fear and denial, and Walter had become a master of it. And he told no one. Not his son, who lived across the country and called only on birthdays and major holidays. Not Mary, the neighbor who sometimes brought over lemon bars and tried to convince him to attend church socials. Not Helen, the retired nurse from 2 blocks over who always waved and asked too many questions. Walter had always believed in handling things privately. It was how he was raised. You dealt with your problems, you didn't burden others, you didn't make a fuss unless there was blood, so he kept his routines. Morning walks by the harbor, quiet lunches, evening crossword puzzles in pen, and every time his hand brushed against the lump, a small tremor would pass through his chest, but he said nothing. He waited. But by the end of the 2nd week, he noticed something else. When he swallowed, there was a slight pressure, not pain or just resistance, like the feeling of a shirt collar a half size too small, barely noticeable, definitely ignorable. He stood in front of the mirror one night and tilted his head to the side, inspecting the bulge that now felt more pronounced. Still no discoloration, no swelling. But the asymmetry was clearer now. He knew it. He saw it. But even then, he hesitated. He picked up the phone twice that night, only to set it down again. What would he even say? He imagined the conversation. There's a bump. It's not painful. I feel fine otherwise. It sounded silly, overcautious, neurotic. Walter wasn't that kind of man. He had survived his wife's cancer, years of slow decline, of watching her waste away while doctors murmured about margins and medications. He had held her hand when she couldn't speak anymore, whispered to her when there were no more words left. He had learned painfully that medicine didn't always bring answers. Sometimes it just prolonged the questions. So he told himself again, give it time. It's probably nothing. Don't overreact. But something in him knew, not in the way logic knows, but in the way bones ache before a storm. There was a stillness in his chest that felt unfamiliar, a tightness in the throat that wasn't just physical. He found himself pausing more often, distracted mid-sentence, even though most days he didn't speak much at all. It wasn't pain that haunted him. It was uncertainty, and the quiet realization that maybe, just maybe, this time waiting would not be enough. For years, Walter had placed quiet faith in systems, roads that led to familiar places, mail that arrived predictably, bills that, if paid on time, kept the world running without much interruption. The healthcare system was no different, in his mind. It might have been slow, sometimes frustrating, but it was there. You got in line, you waited your turn. Eventually, someone would help you. But when it came to his health, that wait began to stretch thin. 3 weeks had passed since he first felt the lump. It hadn't disappeared. It hadn't even stayed the same. It had grown. Not drastically, but enough for him to notice, enough for his shirt collar to feel tighter on the right side, enough for him to hear a faint difference in his voice, a soft rasp that settled in the mornings like dust on windowsills. He finally decided to make another call, and the voice on the phone was different this time, older, firmer, less rehearsed. "Yes, Mr. Langley, we can schedule you, but we're looking at a 5-week wait. Would you like to hold for cancellations?" Walter said yes. He waited on hold for 9 minutes, listening to looped piano music that felt like it had been chosen to mock his anxiety. When the receptionist returned, there were no cancellations, but she could put him on a priority list. He thanked her politely, distantly. After he hung up, he stared at the phone, then at the lump in the mirror. It looked like a small knot under his skin, as if something had curled up beneath the surface and refused to leave. And that afternoon, he drove himself to the urgent care clinic on the edge of town. It was a beige, windowless building attached to a pharmacy. The waiting room was bright and crowded. Coughing children, tired mothers, 2 teenagers scrolling on their phones with vacant eyes. Walter sat quietly, filled out a clipboard, and waited. After 70 minutes, a nurse called his name and led him to a small exam room with a cracked stool and a faded anatomy chart on the wall. The doctor who entered was young, no more than 30. Clean-shaven, energetic, slightly rushed. Walter explained the lump. He pointed to it. "Let the doctor feel it." The man frowned briefly, then smiled. "Could be a lymph node, possibly inflamed. Do you have any recent infections?" "No," Walter said. "Well, we'll monitor it. It doesn't look alarming right now. Try warm compresses, stay hydrated. If it gets larger or painful, come back." Walter didn't argue. He nodded. He left. That night, he sat in the dark, his dinner untouched, and wondered why it was so easy to be dismissed. He hadn't exaggerated. He hadn't panicked. He had calmly described the symptoms. He had done everything right, and still the answer was, wait. 2 more days passed, then 5. By the end of the 5th day, he noticed it was no longer just the lump. It was the tightness in his throat, subtle, faint. But there, a kind of pressure that made swallowing slower, heavier. That was when he requested a referral to a specialist. An ENT, the kind of doctor who could see deeper, feel further, know more. It took 2 days just for the request to be processed through insurance, 3 more to be approved. Then, finally, an appointment, 4 weeks away. When he asked if it could be sooner, the nurse said simply, "There's a backlog right now. Everyone's delayed. We'll call if there's a cancellation." By now the fear was growing. Walter didn't talk about it, but it lived in every hour of his day. It hummed beneath the surface of his silences. It followed him on his walks. It sat beside him at meals. It grew with the lump. Late at night, he began searching online forums, cancer support groups, thyroid disease threads, obscure subreddits full of people wondering, worrying, guessing. Some stories sounded like his, some ended well, others did not. One post stayed with him, a woman who had waited 4 months to get her husband diagnosed. He had a mass on his neck, too. It turned out to be a rare soft tissue sarcoma. By the time it was found, it had already spread. He stared at the screen for a long time. Then he opened his calendar. He stared at the tiny black square, his ENT appointment, circled with a shaky pen stroke nearly a month away. And he remembered something his wife used to say, "If something feels wrong, assume it is, until proven otherwise." She had been diagnosed late, breast cancer. The signs had been subtle, then obvious, then impossible to ignore. Walter had lived through her appointments, her tears, the fatigue, the chemotherapy, the final decline. He knew better. He should have known better. Still, he did not call his son. Still, he did not ask a neighbor for advice. Still, he waited, because waiting felt like control, because saying it aloud would mean confronting a truth that terrified him, because even now, a part of him still hoped it would vanish on its own. Things sometimes did, but not always. The waiting room of the ENT clinic smelled faintly of antiseptic and vinyl. Everything was too clean, too quiet, like a stage set for something important, though no one could say what. Walter sat in a stiff-backed chair, his fingers folded tightly in his lap. Around him, muted televisions played, looped hospital promotions, smiling doctors, happy patients. Buzzwords like care, efficiency, and compassion slid across the screen like promises whispered into a void. His appointment had been rescheduled once due to staffing complications. He hadn't complained. He was used to being patient. Today, at last, was his turn. He was led through a long, cold hallway into an exam room that looked just like all the others. Gray countertop, swiveling stool, laminated diagrams of sinuses and vocal cords. The nurse took his vitals without making much eye contact, noted his weight, asked if anything had changed since his last visit. "It's still there," Walter said softly, touching the side of his neck. The nurse nodded, wrote something, and left. 15 minutes passed. Then the door opened, and in walked Dr. Raymond Cole. He moved with the ease of someone used to being in charge, his white coat crisp, his salt and pepper hair slicked neatly back. There was something efficient about him, too smooth, too practiced. Walter sat up straighter. He didn't know what he expected, but it wasn't this. A man who barely glanced at him before turning to his computer. "Mr. Langley," Cole said, finally looking up. "You've got a mass on the right side of your neck?" Walter nodded. "It's been almost 6 weeks. It hasn't gone away. I think it's gotten bigger." Cole clicked through the electronic records. No fever, no weight loss, night sweats, pain, no. "But there's some pressure now when I swallow." Cole stood and approached. His hands were cool and impersonal as he palpated Walter's neck. A few firm presses, a slight tilt of the chin. Then he stepped back. "It's firm, yes," he said, "but still mobile. That's generally a good sign." Walter hesitated. "Should we do a scan? A biopsy, maybe?" Cole gave a thin smile, half reassurance, half dismissal. "At this point, I wouldn't jump to invasive procedures. Let's monitor. Could be reactive, enlarged lymph node, age-related. Unless we see other symptoms, weight loss, systemic signs, I don't think it warrants a biopsy right now. But it's been there for weeks." "Yes," Cole replied, already returning to his chair. "And some benign conditions can persist for that long. If you like, we can do an ultrasound to track it and schedule a follow-up in 6 to 8 weeks. Walter stared at him. 6 to 8? Yes. Unless things change drastically. Something inside Walter tightened. Not physically, but somewhere deeper. He didn't want to argue. Didn't know how. But the words follow up and wait felt like insults. He was 62, not 18. His body didn't bounce back the way it once had, and more than anything, something felt wrong. Cole was already typing notes. His voice became detached, clinical. "I'll put in the ultrasound request. You should hear back from imaging in a few days. Do you have any further questions?" Walter opened his mouth then closed it. He wanted to say, "I watched my wife die of cancer because someone said to wait and see. I know what this feels like. It's not normal." But all he said was no. The appointment lasted 12 minutes. In the parking lot, Walter sat in his car for a long time before starting the engine. He didn't drive home immediately. Instead, he turned left and headed toward the edge of town, toward the sea. There was a rocky overlook he hadn't visited in years, the kind of place where people came to think, or cry, or remember. He stood there as the wind sliced in from the Atlantic, the collar of his coat turned up against the cold. One hand drifted to his neck, still there, still growing, still unanswered, and he thought about Dr. Cole, his calmness, his certainty, his refusal. It wasn't arrogance exactly, it was worse. It was detachment. As if Walter were just another checkbox, another data point. His concern had been processed, categorized, and shelved. He thought again about asking for a second opinion, about insisting, about making a scene, but instead he did what he always did. He waited. That night, the pressure in his throat seemed a little heavier. He took smaller bites of dinner, swallowing slowly, deliberately. When he brushed his teeth, he didn't look in the mirror. It was a Tuesday morning when Walter returned to the medical center. A different wing this time, radiology. The hallway smelled like antiseptic and printer toner. Walls painted a muted taupe tried and failed to be calming. He checked in at the front desk, then took a seat in a cluster of stiff beige chairs arranged in an oval around a chipped end table stacked with magazines years out of date. The waiting room was quiet, save for the occasional cough or the rustle of paper. Walter clasped his hands in his lap and looked straight ahead, trying not to reach for his neck again. He could feel it now without touching it, the subtle pressure, the unwelcome presence. He wondered if anyone else in the room was also pretending not to be afraid. Then she sat down next to him. She moved quickly, confidently, as if this wasn't her first visit, like she knew where to find the warmest spot in a cold room. Mid-30s, maybe younger. Faded jeans, a dark green knit hat pulled low over her forehead. Her nose was a little red from the cold outside, but her eyes were alert, clear. She didn't say hello, just gave him a quick glance and a nod. Walter nodded back. That was all. A few moments passed before she pulled a small notebook from her bag and began to sketch. Quick, sweeping lines. Nothing detailed, more like gestures of thought. He tried not to look, but curiosity got the better of him. "You an artist?" he asked, surprised at his own voice. She turned the notebook so he could see. It was a loose sketch of the room, the chairs, the people, the exit sign glowing above the door. His own figure was roughly outlined, sitting stiffly, hands folded. "Not professionally," she said. "I draw so I don't spiral." Walter raised an eyebrow. "Waiting rooms," she explained. "They mess with your head. You start counting the seconds and imagining all the worst things that could happen. Drawing slows the panic down." He gave a small chuckle. "Makes sense." She offered her hand. "I'm Nina, Walter." They fell into a light, unforced silence. It wasn't uncomfortable. There was something grounding about having another person acknowledge the weight of the moment without asking for the details. Eventually, she spoke again, not looking up from her sketchbook. "You here for an ultrasound?" He nodded. "Neck?" He turned toward her, a little surprised. "Yeah. How'd you know?" She tapped her own collarbone. "I've been where you are. I had a lump. Didn't do anything for 3 months. Thought it was just stress or a pulled muscle. It wasn't." Walter didn't ask for details. He didn't need to. But she went on. "Anyway, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Stage 2 when they finally caught it. Now it's a roller coaster of treatments and blood draws and side effects they don't warn you about." There was no bitterness in her voice, or just weariness, lined with resilience. Walter hesitated, then said, "I asked for a biopsy." Doctor said to wait. Nina stopped sketching. He said, "Wait?" He nodded. 6 to 8 weeks. She shook her head slowly. "Jesus. That's a coin toss you don't want to take." He looked down at his hands. "I don't want to overreact." She closed her notebook. "It's not overreacting if your body is trying to tell you something," or he could respond. A nurse appeared at the doorway and called Nina's name. She stood and shouldered her bag, then turned back to him. "Don't wait too long, Walter," she said softly. "Even quiet things grow." And then she was gone. The drive home felt longer than it should have. Walter followed the same streets he always did. Elm, then Harbor View, then down toward Cherry Lane. But today, the turns felt sharper, the light more brittle, the world less anchored. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, though the roads were dry and mostly empty. At a red light, he glanced into the rearview mirror. The lump was visible now, subtly if you knew where to look, a faint bulge beneath his jawline, interrupting the otherwise ordinary lines of his face. It hadn't been there 6 weeks ago. He knew that for certain. He turned the radio on, then off again almost immediately. The silence suited him more, even if it pressed down heavy on his chest. Back home, the air inside the house felt colder than it should have. He adjusted the thermostat, but the chill didn't lift. It wasn't the kind of cold that came from the vents. It was the kind that settled in bones, that started somewhere inside the ribcage and spread outward. Walter sat in his favorite chair by the window, the one with the faded arms and cushion molded to the shape of him over years of use. Outside, a few birds fluttered across the yard, pecking at the last of the brown leaves scattered by the early frost. The street was still, the way it always was in late autumn, a kind of stillness that matched him perfectly. But his mind was not still. It circled the same phrase again and again. Even quiet things grow. He didn't want to admit how much those words unsettled him, spoken plainly, gently, by a stranger he had met less than an hour before, but they had lodged somewhere deep, where logic couldn't quite reason them away. He had spent weeks convincing himself this was nothing, that the body made strange noises sometimes, that aging came with its quirks, new lumps, new tightness, new discomforts. But what if it wasn't age? What if it wasn't harmless? He pressed his fingers against the lump again. It felt denser now. Not hot, not tender, but definitely there, not imagination. And when he swallowed, yes, there it was again. That faint resistance, that subtle delay between action and response, like something wedged between him and ease. The ultrasound hadn't offered answers, just more waiting. He wouldn't get results for several days, maybe a week, maybe more. Meanwhile, his mind filled the space with possibilities. Some were rational, some weren't, but fear didn't ask for permission. It moved in and made itself at home. And he tried to distract himself. Cleaned the kitchen, reorganized the spice drawer, deleted old voicemails. But the presence in his neck remained. It became the center of gravity around which his thoughts orbited tighter and tighter. By dusk, he had stopped trying to pretend. He stood in front of the bathroom mirror, his shirt pulled down to expose his neck. He tilted his head, turned slowly from side to side, studying his reflection as though it belonged to someone else. The bulge was clearer now, the symmetry of his face broken in the most minor yet unmistakable way. He thought about Nina, her calmness, her honesty. The way she hadn't tried to downplay anything, hadn't cushioned her words in comfort. She had looked him in the eye and told the truth, something no one else had done. Later that evening, he found himself sitting in the dark living room, the TV on but muted. A documentary played silently, something about mountains or Arctic wildlife. He didn't know, he wasn't watching, he was remembering. His wife, months before she died, had once said to him, "You can't wait your way out of a problem just because you're afraid to name it." At the time, he hadn't known what to say. Now, the words came back, with a kind of force he couldn't ignore. He looked down at his hands. They were trembling slightly. He didn't sleep much that night. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, counting the seconds between swallows, wondering if the pressure was worse than the night before, or if his fear had simply grown bigger than the lump itself. When sleep came, it came in short bursts, full of strange dreams and waking starts. And through it all, the same line echoed in the back of his mind, like a whisper he couldn't silence. Even quiet things grow. The morning it happened, there was no warning. Walter had woken earlier than usual, his throat dry and raw. The heat had kicked on sometime in the night, leaving the air thick and stale. He shuffled to the kitchen, filled a glass of water, and drank it slowly, tilting his head slightly to the left, a new habit to accommodate the growing discomfort in his neck. It didn't help. The sensation had changed. It was no longer just pressure. It was weight. Not heavy, not unbearable, but undeniably there. As if a stone had been embedded beneath his skin, pressing inward towards something essential. He moved through his morning as best he could, made toast, forgot to butter it, sat down, then stood up again, unsure of what he was trying to remember. By the time the sun had begun to push through the kitchen window, he felt something new. Tightness, not just in his neck but in his chest, as if the air had thickened around him, and each breath required more effort than it should have. He dismissed it at first. Anxiety, poor sleep, a touch of a cold maybe. He poured a second glass of water and drank again. Then the cough came, sharp, dry. One at first, then another, then three more in quick succession. He leaned over the sink, hand on the counter, the glass tipping and clattering into the basin. The next cough was wet, and when he looked down, he saw red. The blood in the sink was bright, not pink, not tinged. Bright, a streak of crimson smeared against white porcelain. For a moment he froze. It was a surreal thing, staring at your own blood outside your body. Not from a cut or scrape, but from somewhere deep and unseen. It felt like a betrayal, a quiet contract broken. Another cough rattled his lungs. More blood followed. This time, it spattered the edge of the sink and caught on the cuff of his sleeve. The panic came fast. He moved to the phone, fingers trembling, dialed 911-1. His voice, when it came, was thin and shaking. He barely remembered what he said, something about blood and breathing and a lump in his neck. The dispatcher stayed calm, told him to unlock the front door and sit down. He obeyed, barely. The ambulance arrived in under 10 minutes. The paramedics were quick, practiced, kind. One of them, a tall woman with a braid and tired eyes, held his wrist and spoke softly as she took his pulse. The other asked questions he barely processed. When did it start? How much blood? Any other symptoms? He tried to answer, but the coughing interrupted him. They placed an oxygen mask over his mouth and lifted him onto the gurney. The living room spun as they wheeled him out. Cold air hit his skin like needles. Then the doors closed and the siren began. In the ambulance, he closed his eyes. Everything inside him felt distant, as if his body were a place he used to live in but no longer fully controlled. His thoughts floated strangely, memories bleeding into fear, logic dissolving beneath the weight of what he could no longer deny. Something was wrong. Deeply, dangerously wrong. In the emergency room was a flurry of white coats and overhead lights. They rushed him through triage, inserted in 4, drew blood. He was wheeled into imaging, first an X-ray, then a CT scan. A nurse asked about medical history, about medications, about family conditions. He answered what he could. A young doctor, no more than 30, stood at his bedside afterward, glancing at the preliminary scans. She didn't say much, only that they had found something, a mass, pressing against his trachea, possibly vascular involvement. She used the phrase aggressive presentation. Walter had heard enough to understand what that meant. They admitted him. He was taken to a room with a window facing the parking lot. The TV mounted on the wall played a news channel with the volume muted. Machines beeped rhythmically around him. A heart monitor tracked the quiet, rapid beats beneath his ribs. He was given steroids to reduce swelling, IV fluids, painkillers, though he hadn't asked. He drifted in and out of sleep for the rest of the day, his dreams fractured and gray. By evening, the coughing had slowed, the bleeding stopped. But the silence in the room was different now. It wasn't just the quiet of solitude. It was the quiet of realization. He had waited too long. Whatever this was, it had already begun to take more than it should have. The hospital room hummed with machines, the kind of steady rhythm that made silence feel louder. Walter stared at the ceiling, his neck stiff against the pillow. He hadn't moved much since the scan. The lump now had a name, mass, they called it in clinical terms. An object, a shape, something measurable. But not yet understood. A nurse came in mid-morning with a clipboard and a practiced smile. She adjusted his 4, checked his vitals, then said softly, "Dr. Patel will be in shortly to talk about your results." Walter nodded. His throat was raw, not from coughing now, but from something deeper, like the echo of fear scraping its way up from the pit of his chest. Dr. Patel arrived just before noon. She was calm, her voice even, her eyes steady but not cold. She sat beside the bed rather than standing, and that small gesture made Walter tense up even more. Doctors sat down for hard conversations. "We've reviewed the scans, Mr. Langley," she said gently. "There's a mass approximately 4.3 centimeters pressing on your trachea. That's why you were having trouble breathing." He nodded slowly. "It appears to be infiltrating soft tissue near your larynx, but we can't say definitively what it is until we biopsy it." "Biopsy," he repeated. "Yes, a fine needle aspiration, Fene. It's a minimally invasive procedure. We'll use ultrasound guidance to extract cells from the mass and send them to pathology. That will give us more information." "And if it's cancer?" "We won't speculate yet," she said, not unkindly. "But I can tell you this, it's growing quickly. And time matters." Walter stared past her, at the window. Outside it had started to rain. A slow drizzle tapped against the glass like a clock ticking. "We'd like to perform the biopsy this afternoon," she added. "We've already cleared a slot." It was all happening fast now. Too fast. For weeks no one had moved. Now they all ran. After she left, Walter asked for his phone. It had been resting in the drawer beside the bed, untouched since he'd arrived. The battery was half dead, but enough remained. He stared at the contact list. There weren't many names. Most had faded with time, people he no longer spoke to, numbers that no longer worked. Then he tapped one name. James Langley, his son. They hadn't spoken in months, maybe longer. There had been no argument, no rupture. Just distance that grew slowly like moss over stone, life, schedules, the inability to say what needed saying. It had all become normal. But now, normal was gone. The phone rang 3 times before James answered. "Dad?" Walter's voice caught in his throat. He hadn't expected that. He had imagined voicemail, imagined not needing to speak. "I'm in the hospital," he said quietly. There was a pause. "What happened?" "A mass. In my neck. They think it might be something serious." James exhaled sharply. "Jesus. When did this start?" "Too long ago." Another pause. Walter could almost hear his son sitting down, the creak of a chair on the other end of the line. "I didn't want to bother you," Walter added. "Didn't want to make a fuss." "Dad, for God's sake, you're not bothering me. I wasn't sure it was anything." "Is it?" "They're doing a biopsy today." And for a moment, the line held nothing but breath. Then James said, "Do you want me to come?" Walter closed his eyes. The question settled somewhere deep. He imagined his son on a plane, rushing through terminals, bringing with him all the words they had never said. It felt too heavy, too sudden. "No," Walter replied. "Not yet. Let's see what they say first, okay? But promise you'll call me. After. I will. I mean it. I will." And after the call, he lay there in silence again. Only now it didn't feel as empty. In the afternoon, they wheeled him down to the procedure room. The lights were bright. The air was cool and dry. A technician prepped his neck with antiseptic. Cool, stinging. The ultrasound probe pressed gently against his skin, mapping the shadow beneath. The doctor explained the process. A thin needle, real-time imaging. Slight discomfort, no more. He heard the words, but they felt distant. When the needle slid in, he barely flinched. The pressure was sharp but brief. He kept his eyes closed the entire time. The worst part wasn't the pain, it was the stillness, knowing that somewhere inside that glass vial was an answer he wasn't sure he was ready to hear. Months after the procedure, they told him results would take 2 to 3 days. He thanked them. He was wheeled back to his room. Outside, the rain had stopped. The clouds remained. He stared at the ceiling again. This time he whispered the word, not aloud, just in his mind. Cancer. It was the first time he had let himself say it, even silently. And suddenly it was real. The hours after the biopsy passed in fragments, light shifting on the hospital walls, nurses coming and going, the quiet beep of machines marking time as precisely as any clock. Walter didn't sleep. Not really. He drifted, eyes half-lidded, thoughts spiraling in slow loops around a single pulsing question: what if it's cancer? But beneath that fear was something older, something buried so deep it had no name. Until now, and her name had been Margaret. They had been married 32 years. She'd been the kind of person who lit up a room without trying, bright scarves, louder laughter than she meant, an unshakable optimism that baffled and humbled him daily. He had always been the quiet one, the planner. She was the spark. Her diagnosis came one spring. Breast cancer, stage 3. It was a lump, too. Small, ignored. By the time they found it, it had already begun to spread. Walter remembered the first appointment, the doctor's mouth moving, words like chemotherapy, mastectomy, invasive. He remembered Margaret squeezing his hand. He remembered not being able to squeeze back. What followed were 2 years of hope measured in scan results, of long car rides to the hospital, silence between them filled only by the static of the radio, of pill bottles lining the kitchen counter, of watching the person he loved vanish inch by inch, smile by smile. He remembered the way her voice had changed, hoarse from radiation, quieter from pain. The night she stopped talking altogether, just eye contact and shallow breathing, and the way her fingers clutched the bed sheets when the morphine wore off. She died on a Tuesday. Just past 6 p.m., the nurse said it was peaceful. Walter wasn't sure what peace meant anymore, and in the years that followed, he had learned how to survive by staying small, still, predictable. He didn't resent life, but he didn't chase it either. He existed in quiet rhythm, trusting that if he stayed within the lines, no more tragedies would find him. Hospitals reminded him of Margaret. Doctors reminded him of powerlessness. That's why, when he felt the lump, he waited, not because he didn't care, but because caring meant facing the possibility of reliving it all. He hadn't realized how strong fear could be until it started sounding like reason. And now, lying in a similar bed, under similar fluorescent lights, Walter felt the past folding over the present like a shadow. He reached toward the nightstand where his journal lay, a small black notebook with a frayed spine. Margaret had given it to him years ago, back when he still believed writing helped. He flipped to a blank page. His hand trembled slightly as he wrote, "I should have come sooner. If this is what I think it is, I waited too long." Again, I told myself it wasn't urgent. I told myself it would go away. I lied, and I wonder now if I did the same thing with her, pretended things were okay until they weren't. I don't know if I can do this again. He stopped, closed the journal, closed his eyes. Somewhere in the hallway, a gurney rolled by. A child cried in a distant room. The world continued on. But in Walter's room, time had stopped moving forward. It only circled back. Dr. Patel returned 2 days later. The timing wasn't a surprise. Nurses had dropped quiet hints, had asked how he was feeling with a softness that felt rehearsed. There's a look people give when they know something you don't yet, and they wish you didn't have to find out. She closed the door gently behind her, pulled the chair closer to his bed, and didn't open the chart right away. Walter knew, before she said a word. Still, He waited. She took a breath. The pathology report came back, she said. It confirms a diagnosis of soft tissue sarcoma. She let the word sit in the air for a moment. Sarcoma. Walter had never heard it spoken aloud before. It didn't sound sharp or cruel or loud. It sounded unfamiliar, like a code word, like something you weren't supposed to hear applied to your own body. It's a rare type of cancer, she continued, that begins in connective tissue, muscles, fat, nerves. In your case, it's affecting the deep tissues of the neck, which is uncommon and potentially aggressive. Walter said nothing. Dr. Patel opened the folder. The tumor is currently about 4.3 centimeters. Its growth rate and position suggest that it's been developing for some time, likely months. He stared at the ceiling. We believe it hasn't metastasized to distant organs yet, which is good. But due to its proximity to your trachea and larynx, we'll need to act quickly. Treatment? He asked, his voice barely audible. Surgery first, followed by radiation, possibly chemotherapy depending on the pathology post-op. And survival? She hesitated. Not dramatically, not cruelly, but just long enough to mark the weight of the answer. Sarcomas are tricky, she said. Every case is different. But with aggressive treatment, many patients respond well, especially if caught before it spreads. Statistically, 5-year survival rates vary. For head and neck sarcomas, it can range from 50 to 70%, depending on stage, margins, and response. She paused, then added, Yours is borderline resectable, meaning we can operate, but it may involve part of the larynx. My voice, he said flatly. She nodded. We'll try to preserve as much function as possible, but the priority is removal. And Walter didn't speak for a long time. He didn't cry, didn't ask why, didn't beg for another opinion. He just drifted. The room felt far away, as though he were watching it through glass. Dr. Patel's voice grew fainter, though she remained right there beside him. Her lips moved. She offered more details, scheduling a consult with the surgical team, meetings with oncology, pre-op labs. He heard none of it, because one word had swallowed all others: sarcoma. When she left, he didn't move. He lay still in the bed, eyes unfocused, hands folded on his stomach like he was already waiting to be buried. He thought about Margaret, how her cancer had arrived like an ambush, how it had taken everything slowly, deliberately, until there was nothing left but silence. Now it had come for him, in a different form, a new disguise, but the same hunger. A nurse came in later to check vitals. She smiled at him too brightly and asked if he needed anything. He shook his head. What could he ask for? A time machine? A second chance? Maybe just silence. He needed silence now. Not out of fear, but out of reverence. Because something inside him had just shifted. Not broken, not yet, but loosened. Like the moment before a rope slips, the pause before the fall. The night before the surgery, the hospital room felt like a holding cell suspended outside of time. The lights were dimmed. The hallway quieted after visiting hours. Somewhere, a janitor's mop glided along the floor like a slow ghost. Walter lay in bed, not asleep, not fully awake, just floating in that strange in-between where hours stretched like shadows. Tomorrow, they would cut into his throat. Tomorrow, he might wake up without a voice. And he had signed the consent forms earlier in the day, pages filled with sterile language, risk of bleeding, loss of function, possible need for tracheostomy. His name scrawled at the bottom, shaky, unfamiliar. The surgical team had visited. Faces he wouldn't remember, voices that spoke in outlines and timelines. No one promised certainty, only the chance of removal, the chance of more time. At some point, a chaplain stopped by. Walter thanked her but declined prayer. She smiled anyway, like someone used to rejection, and left a folded note on his tray table. Hope doesn't have to be loud to be real. He pulled out his journal, wrote slowly, I don't know what I'm more afraid of, dying or surviving without a voice. Margaret used to say that losing her hair felt like losing part of her identity. What if I wake up and I don't recognize myself? What if there's nothing left to say, because no one will hear it? He paused, pen hovering, then added, I think I'm scared of becoming invisible. And the nurse came in around midnight, checked his vitals, adjusted the force. She was kind, quiet. Before leaving, she looked at him gently and asked, Can I get you anything? Walter hesitated, then said, Could you turn off the hallway light? She did. And for the first time in a long time, the dark felt appropriate. But sometime after 2 a.m., he fell asleep. And in the sleep, he dreamed. He was standing at the edge of a lake, still, glass-like, surrounded by pine trees stretching endlessly into gray sky. There was no wind, no birds, only the sound of water lapping gently at the shore. Margaret stood beside him. Not sick, not thin, alive. She wore the red sweater she used to love, the one she refused to throw away even when it frayed at the cuffs. Her hair was long again. Her eyes sparkled. She didn't speak, but somehow he understood her. She looked at him and nodded, not with pity but with knowing, like someone who had already walked the path ahead and was reminding him it was survivable. Then she pointed toward the water. He followed her gaze. There, reflected in the lake, was his own face, older, paler, a long scar curling beneath the jaw. His lips moved, but no sound came. He looked at Margaret. She smiled, and in that smile was the answer he didn't know he needed. He woke up just before dawn. The sky outside his window was bleeding pale orange through the blinds. Somewhere down the hall, a coffee machine sputtered to life. The world was still moving. Walter sat up slowly, reached for the cup of water on his tray, sipped. Then, without thinking, he whispered into the stillness, "Thank you." It came out hoarse, ragged, but real. And maybe he thought that would be enough. And they wheeled him down just after 6:30 a.m. The surgical ward was sterile, humming with quiet motion. Everything there moved on rails, gurneys, machines, people. Walter stared at the lights overhead as they passed by in rhythmic intervals. Each panel of fluorescence felt like a checkpoint, like some final accounting of the life he'd lived so far. No one spoke much. There wasn't much to say. A nurse walked beside him, holding a chart. The anesthesiologist introduced himself. Dr. Ahmed, calm voice, steady eyes. He explained the process, step by step, medication through the IV, drifting off gently, waking up in recovery. Walter nodded, trying to look composed. Inside, a quiet terror pulsed. Not the fear of death exactly, but of the not knowing, the not being anymore in the way you recognize yourself. They stopped at a set of double doors. A nurse squeezed his hand. "We'll take good care of you." He wanted to say something, thank you maybe, or I'm afraid. But instead he closed his eyes as the mask came down, and the world disappeared. When he awoke, it was like being pulled from underwater. There were voices, muted, blurred, shuffling around the room like whispers in fog. Machines beeped softly. Plastic tubing hissed. Light filtered in through his eyelids, too bright and too cold. He tried to speak. Nothing came out. His lips moved. His throat contracted. But no sound followed. Not a groan, not a whisper, or only breath, thin and trapped, escaping in silence. His eyes flew open. The room tilted slightly, then steadied. A nurse noticed, smiled gently. "You're awake." He blinked, tried again. A rasp of air, no more. She leaned in. "Don't try to talk yet. You're intubated during surgery. We expected this. The doctor will be here soon." He nodded, or tried to. Everything felt disconnected. He brought his hand slowly to his neck. Bandages, thick, taped tightly. Then he noticed the whiteboard. It lay on his tray, a marker clipped to its side, ready. They had known. And Dr. Patel arrived within the hour. She moved carefully, respectfully. Like someone entering a sacred space, she sat beside his bed and folded her hands. "The surgery went as planned," she said. "We were able to remove the mass entirely. Margins were clean. That's the good news." Walter listened, heart thudding. "However, to achieve full resection, we had to remove part of your larynx. The tumor was wrapped tightly around critical structures. There was no way to preserve your natural voice." There it was, the confirmation. The silence was permanent. She continued explaining about pathology, radiation, follow-ups, but the words slid past him like water off glass. He stared at the board, picked up the marker. Slowly, in shaky lettering, he wrote, "Will I ever speak again?" She read it and paused, not for long, but long enough to mean something. "There are devices," she said gently, "voice prosthetics, speech therapy. We'll connect you with specialists." He capped the pen, nodded once, that was all. The hours after that passed in strange stillness. He was no longer in pain, at least not in the way pain was usually measured. The morphine dulled the edge of everything. But the absence of voice, that was something the drugs couldn't touch. He didn't know what to do with his hands, didn't know how to express without words. He had never been a man of many speeches. But now, even the simple things, yes, no, help, I'm afraid, We're trapped behind a wall no one could see. He wondered if this was what ghosts felt like. That night, he sat upright in bed, staring at the shadows on the far wall. In the dim light, the whiteboard glowed faintly on his lap. He picked it up again, wrote, "Still here." Then he paused, erased it, wrote something else. "Still me?" He wasn't sure if it was a question or a plea. When nurses were kind, they checked on him often, adjusting pillows, bringing ice chips, asking if he needed anything. One of them, Helen, simply sat with him for a while, saying nothing, just holding the space with her presence. At one point, she reached over and placed her hand gently on his forearm. "You're not alone in this," she whispered. He didn't answer, couldn't, but a tear slid down the side of his face. And she stayed. The days that followed surgery moved slowly, marked not by hours, but by inches. An IV pole being pushed a few steps further, a new bandage being applied, a nurse's voice repeating instructions he could not answer. Walter existed in a world of gestures now, head nods, shrugs, scribbled notes on a whiteboard. At first, even that was too exhausting. But slowly, his body began to accept the change, even if his mind hadn't. The pain ebbed into discomfort. The stitches pulled when he moved. The air felt different when he breathed, as if something vital had shifted, not just physically, but spiritually. He had always believed his voice wasn't important. He didn't speak often, didn't lecture, didn't rant, didn't fill rooms with stories. But now, stripped of it, he understood. Even silence had once been a choice. Now it was a prison. And on the fourth day, a speech-language pathologist arrived. Her name was Clara. Warm eyes, firm posture. She carried a small black case like it held sacred tools. They began with gestures. She explained everything slowly, letting him absorb it at his own pace. "We're going to try a TEP device," she said, writing it on a notepad for him. "A tracheoesophageal prosthesis. It won't sound like your old voice, but it will let you speak again." He nodded, unsure. She showed him how to position the valve, how to press gently against the stoma in his neck, how to control the air. They practiced vowels, then words. The first time he heard the mechanical rasp of sound leave his throat, he flinched. It wasn't his voice. It was low, metallic, broken. But it was sound. It was something he practiced every day. A few minutes. Then more. The words didn't always come cleanly. Sometimes his fingers slipped. Sometimes the air caught. But slowly, with the methodical stubbornness that had once made him a good engineer, he built his new vocabulary. The nurses began to understand him. Then the physical therapists. Then the mirror. Not all at once, not fully, but enough. One afternoon, a week after surgery, Walter was sitting in the rehab garden, an enclosed square of gray benches and struggling shrubs, when he heard a familiar voice behind him. "Hey, silent man." He turned. Nina. She looked thinner, tired, but still unmistakably herself. Hooded sweatshirt, half-finished sketchpad under one arm, mismatched sneakers. "I heard you made it through," she said. "Word travels fast among the walking wounded." He smiled faintly. She walked over, dropped onto the bench beside him. "So," she said, tapping her throat lightly, "I heard you've got the deluxe model now." Walter reached up, pressed a finger against his valve, and rasped, "Sounds like I swallowed a robot." Nina laughed. "Yeah, well, it's a talking robot. That's more than a lot of people get." He nodded. They sat in silence for a bit. "I had another scan," she said quietly. "Results weren't great." He looked at her. She waved it off. "Still here, though. Still making noise." He raised the whiteboard from his lap. Wrote, "Noise is enough." She read it, smiled, then added, "Better than pretending to be fine." They talked for over an hour, about things that didn't matter, movies they hated, food they missed, strange hospital staff, about things that did, grief, time, what it meant to still be breathing after the world tried to shut you down. Nina told him something near the end, just as the sun dipped behind the roofline of the rehab building. "When I first lost my hair, I felt like a stranger to myself, but I realized it's not what leaves you that defines you, it's what you learn to carry after." Walter didn't speak. He didn't need to. She squeezed his hand before she left. That night he looked in the mirror, touched the scar, the stoma, the small plastic valve tucked beneath the skin. Then he practiced. "I am Walter Langley," he said. The voice wasn't his, but the words were. Walter was discharged on a cloudy Thursday afternoon. The sky hung low with winter haze, the kind that dulled the edges of houses and made the world feel quieter than usual. He rode home in silence, the hospital car humming beneath him like a lullaby. He had expected to feel relief. Instead, he felt untethered. The hospital had become a kind of cocoon. Sterile, yes, but predictable. He knew when the meals came, when the nurses made their rounds. He knew which hallway creaked and which elevator stalled. Now, he was going back to the unknown. His house hadn't changed, but he had. The front door creaked as it always did. The coat rack still held Margaret's jacket. The living room still smelled faintly of cedar and dust. The framed photo on the mantel showed him at 55, still full-voiced, still unaware. He stood there for a long time, letting the stillness wrap around him. Then, with deliberate motion, he reached up and unclipped the scarf from around his neck, exposing the trach valve beneath. The mirror in the hall caught the image. It startled him. This wasn't how he imagined coming home. He'd thought he would feel victorious. Instead, he felt unrecognizable. That evening, he walked down the street for the first time in nearly a month. Slowly, carefully. The cold nipped at his skin, and the breeze curled under his collar. His breath clouded in the air like smoke. Neighbors were out, raking leaves, walking dogs, bringing in groceries. Some waved, some didn't. Most stared, then quickly looked away. He couldn't blame them. The scar on his neck was still angry and red. The voice, when he used it, came out in short, raspy tones, too mechanical to feel real. He tried not to speak unless necessary. At the end of the block, Mrs. Carver stepped out of her garden gate. She was in her 70s, with thick glasses and a voice that always sounded like she was mid-sigh. "Walter," she said gently, surprised. "You're home." He nodded. She stepped closer, squinting at the valve. I wasn't sure." He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out the whiteboard he now carried everywhere. Wrote, "Surgery, still healing." She read it. Her face softened. "Well," she said, clearing her throat, "it's good to see you. Don't be a stranger." He gave a small wave. As she turned back toward her roses, he thought, not being a stranger might be harder than it sounds. Later that night, he sat at the kitchen table, journal open. The house felt enormous now. Rooms echoed. Air moved differently. He wrote, "Everyone looked away today. I don't blame them. I might do the same if I saw myself from the outside. I wonder if I'll ever stop thinking about what I used to sound like." Then, after a pause, "It's not the loss that hurts. It's the distance between me and the rest of the world." The next day, a brochure came in the mail. It had been sent by the hospital's recovery coordinator. He almost threw it out until he saw Nina's handwriting in the margin. "You should come. You owe yourself the chance." The flyer was for a support group, survivors of head and neck cancer. Every Thursday, 6 p.m. Community Center off Main Street. Walter stared at it. Support group. He had never been one for circles of chairs or public sharing. But then, he had never lost his voice before. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't about speaking. Maybe it was about being heard, without needing to explain everything. He arrived early. The room was small, bright, coffee in the corner, folding chairs in a half circle. A woman in her 50s greeted him warmly. She wore a prosthetic over her jaw. She didn't flinch when she saw his valve. He took a seat in the back. Others trickled in. A man with a feeding tube, a teenager with half her hair regrown, an older man with an electrolarynx tucked in his shirt pocket. No one looked away. When the meeting started, the leader, a man named Jorge, welcomed everyone. Walter didn't introduce himself at first, but halfway through, when someone asked how long it took to feel normal, he lifted his whiteboard and wrote, "I'm still figuring that out." The room nodded. Someone smiled. For the first time since surgery, Walter felt something settle inside him. Not comfort exactly, but kinship, a belonging that didn't depend on sound, just presence. That night, walking home, the wind felt less sharp. The houses looked less foreign. He pulled the scarf tighter, not to hide, but to keep warm. And in his chest, where panic used to live, something new had taken root, resolve. Walter had been attending the Thursday support group for 3 weeks when Clara, the speech pathologist, pulled him aside after a session. "You're becoming something of a rock in there," she said, smiling. "People are starting to look to you when they get overwhelmed." Walter wrote on his notepad, "Maybe because I'm quiet." She laughed, "Maybe, but I think it's something else." He tilted his head, curious. "You listen," she said, "not just with your ears, with your face, your whole presence. That matters more than you think. He didn't know when it had shifted. At first, he was just trying to survive the hour, sitting still, avoiding eye contact, scribbling a few words when prompted. But over time, he began leaning in, nodding more, offering written encouragement, even speaking slowly, carefully, with the raspy digital voice he was still getting used to. People noticed, and for the first time since the surgery, Walter noticed them noticing, and didn't shrink. He was still Walter, not the old one, not the same one, but still him. One Thursday, as he arranged chairs before the meeting, Jorge came in with a clipboard. "We have a guest tonight," he said. "Family of one of our members said he wanted to observe." Walter nodded, not thinking much of it. The meeting began like usual. Introductions, check-ins, a few awkward jokes to cut the tension. Walter sat near the side, fingers curled loosely around his marker. Halfway through, the door creaked open. He turned casually and froze. James, his son, stood in the doorway, hands in his coat pockets, face pale but composed. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then James nodded slightly and took a seat in the back row. Walter's heart thudded, not from fear, but from weight, the weight of the moment, the unspoken years, the distance covered in silence. As the meeting moved on, Walter found it harder to concentrate. Stories floated by, struggles with prosthetics, tips for eating with new anatomy, the humor of trying to sing with a machine. He heard them all, but only halfway. His eyes kept drifting to the back row, to James, who listened attentively, occasionally nodding, never looking away. Finally, near the end, Jorge opened the floor for last comments. Walter raised a hand. The room quieted. He stood slowly, pressed his finger to his valve, and spoke, deliberately, carefully. "When I lost my voice, I thought I'd lost the part of me that could reach people." A pause, but it turns out, listening says more than I ever did out loud. He looked at James as he said it. The group murmured their support, a few clapped softly. Walter sat down, breath trembling. After the meeting, James approached slowly. They stood in the hallway, father and son, years of missed dinners and birthday calls echoing between them like ghosts. James spoke first. "I didn't know what to expect," he said. "I thought I'd just come to watch. But then I saw you and heard you." Walter lifted his hands, gestured, "Thank you." Then picked up his whiteboard, wrote, "I should have asked you to come sooner." James read it, swallowed hard. "Then I should have come anyway." They stood quietly. Then James added softly, "I'm proud of you, Dad." Walter blinked fast, reached for the board again, paused. Then, with steady fingers, pressed the valve and said, haltingly, but clearly, "I'm proud of you too." It wasn't the voice James remembered, but it was his father. And it was enough. That night, Walter didn't journal. He sat instead in the kitchen, tea cooling beside him, staring out the window at the stars just beginning to appear. He didn't feel whole, he didn't feel healed, but he felt human, and after everything, that felt like a miracle. The envelope came one Tuesday morning in early spring. Walter found it among the usual stack of bills and circulars, thicker paper, hand-addressed, the kind of envelope that suggested care. He opened it slowly, carefully, as if the message might crumble under rough hands. Inside was a note, handwritten. "Dear Walter, I don't know if you realize what you did for me last week, or you probably thought it was nothing, just another one of your quiet nods, or a short sentence scratched on your board. But when I couldn't speak through my tears, when I thought I'd completely broken in front of that circle, you looked me in the eye. You didn't flinch. You didn't look away. And when I asked, 'What now?' with just a shrug, you wrote one word, 'Continue.' It changed everything for me. Thank you, Meredith." He held the letter for a long time, reading and rereading it. The word she'd quoted back to him, "continue," echoed in his chest like a drumbeat. That night he wrote in his journal, "I didn't need a podium, just a pen. I didn't need a stage, just presence." A week later, Clara reached out. "We're organizing a patient-centered panel," she explained. "Community health fair downtown. Physicians, families, policymakers, press. They want a survivor's voice. I thought of you." Walter stared at the message on his phone for several minutes. A voice. He didn't have one. Not in the old sense. But maybe that wasn't the point anymore. He called her back. The auditorium wasn't large, maybe 50 seats, folding chairs lined up in rows. A simple stage, one microphone. Posters on easels showed statistics about head and neck cancer, recovery rates, Early detection guidelines. Volunteers passed out pamphlets and mini bottles of water. Walter arrived early. He wore his best shirt, ironed that morning. The scarf was folded neatly in his pocket, but he didn't wear it. His trach was visible, his prosthesis clean and polished. He sat backstage with his notes and a small portable speaker device synced to his valve, a clearer version of the mechanical voice he used for daily speech. A young technician helped test the mic. "You ready?" she asked. Walter gave her a thumbs up, then the lights dimmed. The moderator gave a brief introduction, then called his name. "Please welcome Mr. Walter Langley, cancer survivor, advocate, and voice for those learning to speak again." Applause. Walter stepped slowly onto the stage. The microphone stood taller than him. He adjusted it slightly, cleared his mechanical throat, and pressed the button on his valve. A static hum, then silence. Then, in that low, rasped, digitized tone, "Good evening." Some people shifted forward in their chairs. Others sat very still. There was something compelling about hearing a voice that wasn't natural but was filled with intention. Walter continued, each word paced, deliberate. "2 years ago, I ignored a lump in my neck. I told myself it was nothing. I waited. I was wrong." He paused. "By the time I went in, the tumor was close to my windpipe. I couldn't breathe right, couldn't swallow properly. I was afraid, not of dying, but of being seen as broken." A hush fell over the crowd. "When they told me I'd lose my voice, I grieved harder than I thought I would. Not because I spoke a lot before, but because I thought, without a voice, how would I ever matter again?" He looked across the rows. "Turns out, you don't need perfect sound to tell the truth. You just need someone willing to listen." People leaned in now. "This prosthetic," he tapped his neck gently, "makes me sound like a machine. But what it allows me to say is deeply human." A few quiet nods. "Early detection saves lives. So does community. So does courage. I'm not here to tell you it's easy. I'm here to tell you it's possible." He ended with the word "continue" and stepped back. Silence. Then applause. Warm, sustained, real. Afterward, people lined up to shake his hand. A man whose wife had just been diagnosed. A teenager with a bandana over her throat. A nurse who whispered, "My father never spoke after his surgery. Thank you for doing this." Walter smiled, nodded, wrote short messages when his voice grew tired. Outside, dusk was settling. The streetlights flickered on, one by one. James waited by the curb, leaning against his car, arms crossed and proud. Walter walked toward him. James didn't say anything right away. He just gave him a long, firm hug. Then whispered, "You didn't just speak tonight. You sang." Walter laughed, a soft, breathy rasp. And for the first time in a long, long time, he didn't feel like a patient. He felt like a person. The diner was mostly empty that evening. A bell chimed as Walter and James stepped inside, the smell of old coffee and bacon grease lingering in the air like memory. It was the same place they used to come when James was a boy, after Saturday errands or rainy Sundays when nothing else was open. They chose a booth by the window. James slid into his seat, glancing across at his father, still visibly processing everything he had witnessed that night. Walter eased into the bench with care. He removed his scarf, revealing the valve on his throat, and adjusted the speaker clipped discreetly to his collar. The waitress approached, older, kind-eyed. She greeted them with practiced cheer. "Evening, fellas. Coffee?" James nodded. Walter raised a hand politely. The waitress hesitated for a second at the sight of his neck, but then smiled and poured them both cups. They didn't speak at first. James stirred cream into his mug, the spoon clinking rhythmically. Walter folded the edge of a napkin, then unfolded it again. Finally, James broke the silence. "You used to come here with Mom, didn't you?" Walter nodded slowly, pressed the button. She liked the pancakes. A pause. Then Walter added, even softer, "with peanut butter. Weird habit." James smiled faintly. "I remember that." More silence. But it wasn't heavy now. It was thoughtful, shared. James leaned back, watching his father. "I think, after she died, I didn't know how to be around you." Walter looked up. "You didn't say much," James continued. "You just kind of went quiet, and I thought maybe you were angry at me, or that you blamed me for not visiting more often, for not being there when she—" He stopped. Walter reached into his coat pocket, pulled out the small notepad he still kept, just in case. He wrote, "I never blamed you." Then he flipped the page and added, "I just didn't know how to speak grief out loud." James read the words, blinked, then gave a small, pained laugh. Guess I didn't either. They ordered dinner, meatloaf for Walter, a BLT for James. As they ate, the conversation deepened. Walter tapped his valve again. She told me to keep going. Before the end, said I had more to say. James looked up. You think she knew this would happen? Walter shook his head. Not this. He gestured to his throat. But maybe. Silence of another kind. James took a slow bite of sandwich, chewed thoughtfully, then asked, Were you scared when you woke up and couldn't talk? Walter paused, then pressed, terrified. A long breath. Felt like I was buried, but breathing. James nodded slowly. I never asked you how you were after she died, he said quietly. I was barely holding it together myself. Walter reached across the table, laid his hand over his son's. You were a kid. You weren't supposed to hold anything. They stayed like that for a moment, hands still, food forgotten. Later, over their second cup of coffee, James asked something he hadn't dared until now. Do you ever miss your old voice? Walter smiled, sad but true. He didn't answer right away. Then, with careful effort, I miss what it allowed. Spontaneity, humor, ease, pause. But now, I weigh every word. I choose. James considered that. And is that a good thing? Walter wrote on the napkin this time. Maybe it's not about good, maybe it's about meaning. James folded the napkin and tucked it into his pocket. I think Mom would have loved that. Walter's eyes glistened, but he didn't look away. They paid the bill and stepped outside. The air was cool, crisp. Streetlights cast soft halos over the sidewalk. The world for once felt still. As they walked toward the car, James asked, So what now? Walter shrugged gently, then smiled and spoke. Mechanical voice humming, Now we live. The meeting room smelled faintly of coffee, hand sanitizer, and winter coats. Folding chairs were arranged in a circle. On the whiteboard at the front, someone had written in bold blue letters, Welcome back, Walter. Walter smiled when he saw it. It had been nearly 6 weeks since his last meeting, since the speaking engagement, the dinner with James, and the quiet days of adjusting to a new rhythm of life. Now Clara and Jorge had asked if he might be willing to co-lead the support group just once, see how it felt. He'd said yes. And now here he was, standing not at the edge of the room, but at the center, and then people trickled in, familiar faces, light laughter, nods of recognition. Meredith with a new scarf, Jorge always early, Nina back again after a round of radiation, thinner but still sharp-tongued. Walter welcomed them with nods, gestures, short sentences through his prosthetic voice. The speaker clipped to his collar now felt less like a tool and more like an extension. At 6:04, Clara gave him a nod. Walter stepped forward, pressed the button at his throat, spoke slowly. Good evening, I'm Walter, and tonight we begin with a reminder. Every story here matters, even the ones we're afraid to tell. He looked around the circle. This isn't about being brave, it's about being real. A few people nodded. The group began. The conversation flowed gently. One man shared how he struggled to eat in front of people. A woman described the terror of losing her sense of smell. Someone else admitted they hadn't left the house in 3 weeks. Walter listened, responded with care. He didn't try to fix anything. He didn't pretend to have all the answers. He just held space. Near the end of the hour, the door opened quietly. A young man stood in the frame, late 20s maybe, thin, pale, wearing a hoodie pulled too far over his head. A surgical dressing was still visible above his collarbone. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. He hovered, unsure. Walter caught his eye, walked to the door. Up close, the young man's discomfort was palpable. His hands trembled, his eyes darted nervously. He stammered. They said this was the, throat cancer group? Walter nodded, reached into his pocket, pulled out the notepad he no longer used much but still carried, wrote slowly, You're in the right place. He held it up. The young man read it, nodded slowly. I don't really talk anymore, he said. Walter tapped his valve, spoke through the device, me neither, but we still communicate. He gestured to the empty chair beside Nina. The young man hesitated, then walked in, sat. Walter returned to the center, paused, then said to the whole group, We have someone new with us tonight. His name doesn't matter yet. What matters is that he came. He looked directly at the young man, and that is everything. After the meeting, people lingered. There was coffee, quiet conversations, some laughter. But Walter noticed the young man hadn't moved. He still sat stiffly, hands folded, eyes lowered. Walter walked over, kneeled slightly beside him, rested a hand gently on his shoulder, waited until the young man looked up. And then, with a voice that hummed not with perfection but with purpose, Walter said, "You're not alone." That night, Walter walked home alone under a sky freckled with stars, the scarf wrapped loosely around his neck, his hands deep in his pockets. He passed by the dark windows of houses he knew by heart. The Langley house, once full, now quieter, still standing. He didn't cry, didn't smile, or he just breathed. And for the first time in what felt like a very long time, it sounded enough like a voice. If you're listening to this, and you're somewhere in the middle of your own fight, maybe you just got diagnosed, or maybe you've already lost something you never thought you could live without, this is what I want to say to you. You are not broken. You are becoming. This path is not easy. I won't pretend it is. But there is life after the silence. There is dignity after the surgery. There is purpose, even in pain. I've lost my voice, but I've learned to speak with more than words, through stillness, through kindness, through presence. So don't give up when your voice shakes. Don't retreat when others look away. Speak anyway. Live anyway. Continue. To those of you who still have your voice, use it to listen. And to those who've lost it, know this, you're not alone. You never were. If this story touched something in you, share it, because someone out there needs to hear what survival really sounds like.